All right, welcome everybody to this online symposium at San Beda University Graduate School of Law. It's part of the Law and Economics of Corruption class course that's being offered at San Beda, and the title of it is Corruption: Cause and Cure: A Law and Economics Response. Um, we have people coming in from all parts of the Philippines, and for some of our speakers, they're coming in from other parts of the world. I believe as far away as another country in Southeast Asia and the UK and America. For the benefit of our audience and for our panelists, I'll quickly go through the agenda and then we will welcome our first speaker. Okay, the agenda begins with Professor Matthew Stevenson from Harvard University School of Law. He'll set the stage with some basic concepts about let's say perhaps better, an overall view of the law and economics approach to corruption. And following him will be four of our panelists, Mr. Noel Noglob, Mr. Jan Michael Balisado, Ms. Gali Dulnuan, and Ms. Maria Faye Taal Gallardo. They will be responding to Professor Matthew Stevenson's remarks and giving some insights from their own experiences and their own studies, shall we say, their own research and exposure to this topic. Okay, that will last until about 3:20, and then after that we'll take a short break. And then after the break we'll have what happened here? Hang on. We have Professor Sean Hagen from Georgetown University School of Law. Professor Hagen will be talking about finding solutions and has prepared a nice PowerPoint solution to go with his talk. After Mr. Hagen is done, or Professor Hagen is done, we'll hear from panelists Fevi Ann Gador, Ms. Beverly Tan, Ms. Mary Besadel Dulé, and Ms. Amy Flor A. Laura, who will be sharing with us their perspectives, both from their in-depth studies of the law and economics of corruption and perhaps some of their personal experiences and observations about the situation in the Philippines and elsewhere. Okay. After the Sean Hagen talk, we will retire to the grand dining room where we will have dinner, and we will hear during dinner from Professor Carolyn Coverly from the Virginia Commonwealth University. And given some time constraints we have, Ms. Coverly will be talking about, for only a short period of time, and we'll be focusing a lot on the nuts and bolts of the policy, or sort of distilling a lot of the concepts. But as I have seen in some of her other talks, she definitely has some different perspectives than some of the earlier speakers. Finally, as the master of ceremonies of this event, I will finish with some dessert remarks, as that we're calling them. So as we're having our coffee and cake, you can hear from me. I forgot to mention that two of our prior panelists have graciously volunteered to serve as panelists for Ms. Coverly's, or Professor Coverly's, speech, and that is Ms. Fevian Gador and Noel Glub. So on that note, I think we're just about ready to welcome Professor Stevenson, and he will be coming to us, as we know, remotely in this modern world we live in. What I'm going to have to do here is I'm going to have to stop sharing for a minute and then bring on Professor Stevenson from on another screen. So please bear with me for a minute or two while I and the technicians figure this out. Everyone cross their fingers that nothing goes wrong. So just bear with me. Okay, we are going to be coming in, well, let's just say Professor Stevenson has been talking for the last 47 minutes. I hope you all enjoyed that. We had a small technical glitch, and we'll be getting right back to him in a second. And he's about, according to our timeline, he's about 12 minutes. He has 12 more minutes on the clock, and we'll listen to him, and then we'll respond. So just hang on with me as I share the screen. Hang on one second as we continue to work our way through these issues. Okay, now people can see the screen? Good. Okay, just hang on one more second with me. And I appreciate Noel helping me out with this earlier. Okay, I'm going to back up a few seconds and make sure we can hear him. Put your thumbs up if you can hear him.
Come up with really good, clear answers for how one does it in the anti-corruption context. And
okay, thanks everybody. Thank you. We're back. We fixed all our technical issues. Professor Stevenson, can you hear us? If you can, please resume your conversation with us after the count of 3. 1, 2, 3.
the reason, and I think this is really important to focus on, because it is, I think the fundamental problem with addressing corruption effectively and moving from the vicious cycle world to the virtuous cycle world is a political problem. And the political problem takes the following form. The people with the strongest incentives to do something about corruption, the people who are most disadvantaged by a corrupt status quo, are often the people with the least ability to actually do anything about it. While, in general, the people with the most ability to do something about a corrupt status quo tend to be the people who have benefited most from that status quo, and therefore won't have very strong incentives to do much of it. Typically, the losers don't have sufficient power, and the winners don't have sufficient incentives to make change, because after all, they're winning under the existing system. So what can one do about this? Well, again, I don't think researchers have really nailed this down, but let me offer a few models that have emerged for countries that have managed to do something about corruption that they can deal with or somehow get around this fundamental political problem before offering some closing remarks and moving to Q&A. So one way you can get around this problem is to have a leader who is very powerful, relatively few checks on his or her power, who is far-sighted and public-spirited, and very secure in his or her position, who can just decide that anti-corruption is a priority and push through dramatic reforms of the society and aggressive enforcement of anti-corruption rules against those who break the rules. So this can work, or so it seems. This, I think, is the Lee Kuan Yew model in Singapore. This is, I think, also accurately captures Hong Kong, where it was still under British control. The Governor General decided this was going to be a priority. You see this, I think, in places like the Republic of Georgia, where a very strong president had pushed aggressive anti-corruption reforms. I think Xi Jinping in China very much is trying to embrace this approach. So I don't want to dismiss it entirely, but I'm not a huge fan of the powerful single leader who wants to reform the society model. You can think of this like the good king model. And the reason that I'm skeptical of this is, of course, this is great if you get a good king. But the basic idea of organizing a society where you concentrate so much power in one person is very dangerous, right? There are societies that have effectively dealt with corruption much more rapidly than any democracy because they have this concentration of power. But if you look across the world, many of the countries with the worst record on corruption and many other things have extraordinary powers concentrated in a single leader who's not really accountable and who's very secure in his or her power. Right? Until his recent removal, Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe is kind of this example. So you might hope you'll get Lee Kuan Yew. You might end up with Robert Mugabe. And so I'm not necessarily enthusiastic about the idea that the way to fight corruption is to concentrate lots of power in an entity in the executive branch or the senior political leader and hope that that person is public-spirited and does the right thing. Even though, for fast anti-corruption reform, that's probably the best one to vote for. A second model through which we sometimes get substantial anti-corruption reforms despite this fundamental political problem that I just described occurs when you see moments of dramatic reform or crisis or disruption of the existing political status quo. I actually think Indonesia may be an illustration of this, though again, I'm a little bit reluctant to comment on Indonesian politics because I'm not an expert, but my impression is that the transition from the Suharto period to the contemporary Indonesian democracy, the Reformasi period in 1998, was such a disruption of the status quo that it was actually possible to do things, to implement reforms like the creation of the KPK and the Tipikor courts and other measures that simply would not have been possible under ordinary political circumstances. So sometimes in a moment of crisis, you can effect changes that are much bigger than you could in ordinary times. After all, people don't know who the winners and losers are, right? They're behind a kind of veil of ignorance in those moments of crisis or disruption. And that creates, admittedly, some danger, but also opportunity. Now, I think this is actually important. One of the implications of this is for those who care a lot about anti-corruption reform, be prepared. It might seem like you're laboring with no result. You're developing all these ideas and proposals and concepts for how the society can be improved, but nobody is listening because the people in power aren't interested in making genuine change. But if you put in that thought, and if people are well-positioned, if there are civil society advocates and others, well-meaning people in the government and the business community, then when a crisis comes, you'll probably have a fairly narrow window of opportunity to effect change, and you want to be prepared when that moment occurs. So I actually think this take advantage of a crisis approach to dealing with corruption is actually really important. At the same time, I think many people would say, well, that's nice and all, but we can't just sit around waiting for a political crisis. We probably don't even want to wish for a political crisis because they can cause more problems than anything else. So that's fine. What else can be done? So a third approach to getting around this fundamental political problem is to find ways to advocate and implement reforms, the consequences of which are either not obvious to those who are in power right now, or where the consequences are sufficiently long-term that people in power right now are not too concerned. So, again, this is somewhat unsatisfying because you're not doing as much about corruption today, but I do think there is some evidence that even highly corrupt societies or countries where there's very little chance of doing anything in the short term, it's possible to put in place policies or institutions or structures that do have important longer-term consequences for the fight against corruption. I think Brazil may provide a contemporary illustration in that, as many of you know, right now there are ongoing investigations of corruption stemming from activities of the Brazilian state-owned oil company Petrobras that are being conducted by quite independent prosecutors in an environment where there's very strong public support for doing something about corruption. I think that there's some evidence, although admittedly not conclusive, that the groundwork for the current investigations into Petrobras were actually laid 10 to 20 years ago under the administration of President Lula, whose administration was itself highly corrupt, where President Lula has himself been implicated in the current anti-corruption investigation. There were changes to the Constitution that gave prosecutors more autonomy and more power. There were substantial efforts to crack down on corruption at the local level, which even a corrupt administration at the central level is often happy to do. But those changes at the local level may well have affected people's attitudes towards corruption in ways that were quite productive. So I do think it's possible to see these long-term changes growing out of reforms right now in the short term, or to implement reforms where maybe people don't really fully appreciate the implications. So I mentioned before things like anonymous company transparency. Might be able to get people on board with that by framing it as an issue of national security or an anti-drug measure. Even though ultimately that will make it more difficult for powerful public and private sector actors to hide their assets. So sometimes there's an argument that, look, this is partly about corruption and tax evasion, but let's frame it as about drugs and terrorism. So we frame it as about drugs and terrorism, we'll make more progress with those who are currently in political power, and they kind of won't necessarily realize or appreciate the fact that we're putting in place frameworks that will ultimately have an anti-corruption impact. So that's possible as well. But I think none of these three are entirely satisfactory, which brings me to a fourth, which I do think is absolutely critical, and the one that I want to emphasize especially to this audience. And that's pressure from below, pressure from the society. So I described the fundamental political problem as one where those who are most adversely affected by corruption have the least ability to do anything about it. Those with the most ability to do something about it have weak incentives, typically, to do anything about it because they're benefiting from keeping things the way they are. Well, one thing one can do in that situation is to try to change the political calculus by making it such that they feel like they have to do something, they have to address the problem, or the citizenry won't stand for it. Whether this is people pouring into the streets, as we've seen in places like Romania or Costa Rica or Egypt, I'd say we won't support it, and it has happened in Indonesia in the not-too-distant past, to how you vote in national elections, to how in all sorts of subtle ways throughout the society people send the message that we won't tolerate corruption, we think it's wrongful, we don't think it's okay, we don't think it's part of our culture, we do think our political leaders can be held accountable. Individually, none of these things might seem like much, but cumulatively, they can add up to a great deal and can make even leaders who are not so excited about taking significant action against corruption feel like they have to, feel like they have no choice. And I think that I want to emphasize that observation at the conclusion of these remarks, because I do think giving a lecture at a place like the University of Indonesia, which is for your country what universities like my own, Harvard University, and some others like Yale and Stanford are back in the United States. These are institutions that have many missions. They promote education, they further knowledge, but they also train the elite of the next generation. Whether it's people who are already coming from elite backgrounds, who are getting that education and carrying on that tradition, or whether it's people from non-elite backgrounds, people who are the first in their family to go to a university, in some cases the first in their family to escape rural poverty. It's their passport into the elite. But it's also a place, university is also a place that really is committed to fostering self-reflection, social advocacy, understandings of justice and values. So it's that combination, people who are members of the elite, who do have that power, more power than most people in my country or in your country, to actually make change, but who also, we hope, will not be satisfied with maintaining a status quo, even if those people individually, personally benefit from that status quo. That group of people, which I hope and expect will include many of the people in this room, can often be key change makers. They're the ones who can really drive change. They're the business leaders who are not content to accept a status quo, even if they're the ones who can pull the strings and take advantage of their connections. They're the educators who foster the right set of values in the next generation. They're the public servants who do go into these bureaucracies that have reputations for corruption, but who won't stand for it and are committed to making it better. They're the civil society activists. They're the people with the clout and the connections to get something done in the society, and who are also deeply committed to getting something done. And I ultimately think it's that group of people, really you, partly the faculty, but especially the students, who have an absolutely vital role to play in transforming societies, many societies, including this one, from this vicious cycle where corruption begets poverty and cynicism and ineffective institutions, which in turn begets more corruption, to societies that are characterized by virtuous circles, where integrity promotes wealth, a rising standard of living, a culture of honesty and commitment to a strong and effective government civil society. So that's what I have to offer by way of my general remarks, but we have, I believe, ample time, which is what I was hoping, for a question and answer session. So I'll stop there, and I don't know if someone else wants to keep the queue or call on people, if I'm supposed to do that. We'll figure that out. Do we have a microphone, or do you have microphones at your desk? Great. That's where I'll stop.
Okay, thank you, Professor Stevenson. Now, let's put together our panelists here, Mr. Noel, Mr. Jan, Ms. Gali, and Ms. Maria. I hope you are ready and online technically. Oh, wait, I'm getting a note from Professor Stevenson. He apologizes by making a mistake as to which university he was addressing. He's very jet lagged, and he was at the University of Indonesia yesterday, and he meant to say San Beda, and all the good things he said about the University of Indonesia, he says doubly applies to the San Beda College of Law. So, yeah, thank you, Professor Stevenson. I'll convey your most sincere apologies to the group. And I know you're listening in, but you don't have any. You're speaking. Okay. You have no longer any opportunity to speak to us, but he can listen. So that's important here. So we're going to have to take this ourselves. The rest of the this session will have to be done by the panelists, and hopefully I can facilitate, but hopefully you guys can run this and respond. So Professor Stevenson would love to hear more about the Philippines and what's going on there, and what you guys have been studying and how it might or might not differ from what he's saying. So in the order that I just said, Mr. Knoll, Mr. Jan, Ms. Gali, and Ms. Maria will move forward. So let's start with Mr. Knoll, who is coming to us from the Philippines. Thanks, Mr. Knoll. What might you want to share with us about this particular presentation and your thoughts?
Yes, sir. Professor Stephenson, thank you for the very enlightening and informative lecture. Indeed, there are some points that I agree with as far as the lecture is concerned, like as to the reforms that he has suggested. It's really very dangerous if we rely on a strong man to effect the reforms to combat corruption, especially if the corruption is so endemic and systemic that even the strong man might be the one who would be the leader of that corruption. As to the second one, which is a disruption or sort of an event that is extraordinary, I don't think that's also a good alternative, because we would be fence sitters. We'll be waiting for something to happen before we could initiate reforms against corruption. The third one, I like the third one. That's the coalition of activists, businessmen, civil society, students, especially educators, schools, and of course the other sectors who could really move so that uh, such reform or the activities for reform would be implemented. But I'd like to know, Professor Stephenson, if you have thought about corruption as a crime against humanity, so that the corruptors or the ones who are guilty or who committed corruption, especially the president or the head of the state, could be brought to the International Criminal Court, ICC, and be prosecuted for this crime of corruption, which is against humanity. I have a strong conviction that corruption is a crime against humanity because of its effect. Since we have learned that rent seeking would not really bring so much benefit to the people, as government officials who are corrupt would be pocketing the money, then this would really disrupt and have adverse effect on the government. That is why I'd like to know, Professor Stephenson, if indeed I am correct in assuming that corruption could be a crime against humanity, so that the corrupt government officials could be brought to the International Criminal Court under the Rome Statute.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Knoll. I'm hearing from Professor Stevenson that he heard it. He cannot respond directly though, and he's taking some notes down about the ICC question, and he will get back to you after he hears from the other three panelists. So it's a great question. He welcomes it, and I'll see what he has to say, and hopefully he can convey it on his behalf at the end of this panel. So moving on, I'd like to hear from Mr. John Belisato, his responses and thoughts about the presentation of Professor Stevenson. And if you have any responses to anything Mr. Knoll says, I'm happy to make this a free-flowing conversation to the extent possible. So, Jan, you may want to turn off your mute button and share with us your knowledge.
Yes, Prof. Good afternoon, Professor. Good afternoon, Mr. Stevenson. Good afternoon, classmates. Actually, I agree with one of our esteemed panelists, Mr. Knoll, in regards to the three anti-corruption models that Mr. Stevenson was able to discuss. As to the first model, the Lee Kuan Yew model, I don't think that is going to be much of a help, because it's like gambling. It's okay if you have a good king, but at the same time you also have the risk that the leader of a nation would be a mad king, somewhat similar to Game of Thrones. So it's actually, as to the Lee Kuan Yew model, it's actually a bit of a gamble. But as to the second model, where there has to exist a crisis, because there's a saying, I don't know where I read it before, in chaos there is opportunity. I think I watched it from a series from Netflix, particularly Narcos. But to wait for a particular crisis to exist, in which we have to exact change in the models of our government, that might take a while. But as to the third anti-corruption model that Mr. Stephenson was able to discuss, as to activating incremental reforms, actually that would be a very good model that we could emulate. However, in the Philippine setting, especially in the executive branch of government, where a sitting president only has a 1 year, 6 year term. In activating incremental reforms in the Philippine government might the 6 year term for a president might be actually a barrier, because in every 6 years, if a sitting president, actually we cannot re-elect a president anymore. So if there is a new president and the new president has different ideas or different strategies or different reforms, that could be a barrier as to effecting an anti-corruption model in the Philippine government. And actually, one of the discussions made by Mr. Stephenson was that, well, that actually got my attention, was that those persons who have the ability to effect change are the ones who have the least motivation to enact such change. And especially example in the Philippine setting, where our government is run by certain elites, senators, congressmen actually we have repeatedly the same senators and congressmen for the past, I don't know, 3 decades or 4 decades or so. So changes or reforms that are needed by our country or by the Filipino people may not be as effective if we have the same leadership over and over again. And exactly the point why we need incremental reforms. But to have incremental reforms, we have to have persons who are what do you call this, who are interested in actually making reforms. Because if you look at the setting of our government, where congressmen actually change, the only thing that changes are their first names. Because, for example, in certain provinces or certain areas in our country where dynasties exist, who those dynasties who have been sitting in government for decades have actually very low reason to enact reforms, because they benefit from the existing system. In my opinion, actually enacting an anti-political dynasty bill might be a solution to that problem. But having an existing Congress where majority are members of a particular dynasty, we cannot. There is a very low possibility that reforms might be enacted in the in our current existing government. So those who have the best interest to actually make reforms have actually no power to make such changes. And actually, one of the points that in the discussions of Mr. Stephenson in his Harvard talk, where he talks about a creation of an independent anti-corruption agency. Actually, we have also that here in the Philippines in the form. We have constitutional bodies such as the Sandigan Bayan and the Ombudsman. However, even if we have an anti-graft court or a prosecution arm which focuses on anti-graft and corrupt practices, corruption is still very rampant. Might be so because of the fact that of political or elite capture, where those who are appointed in the ombudsman or in the Sandigan Bayan are actually appointed by a president. So the connections established by the president and the connections established by the prosecutors in the ombudsman or the justices sitting in the Sandigan Bayan might compromise their integrity. So for cases of cases of corruption, there might be instances where an integrity of a justice or a prosecutor might have already been compromised. So that is an area where we need actually incremental reforms, the to escape to is to have that position where justices and prosecutors, where actually we have good justices and prosecutors, but to some extent the integrity of these persons are actually a bit compromised. And in one of
Noel, I'm sorry. I'm going to have to cut you off. We have two other panelists. I appreciate. So just could you wrap it up, your statements, and
I
then, so I didn't want to
I
cut you, but we do have a time constraint.
Yes, I'm sorry, Prof. Actually, those are the things that actually I wanted to discuss a little bit. So,
Okay.
so in my last part, I think the question that we should be asking is how do we effect a change, because the changes that we actually need are aside in the sense that we need an incremental reforms, but at the same time, the change in that we need in the Philippines is actually very massive. It's somewhat of a change of a system, because we cannot have incremental reforms if our current system prevents us from having incremental reforms. So that's a question which I would like to ask Mr. Stephenson, because how do we create incremental change if our existing system disallows that from happening, because of our current because of the current situation of our government? So that would be all for that would be all, Prof and Mr. Stephenson and classmates.
Okay, we got that down. Love to hear now from Ms. Gali, our third panelist.
I'm
Now,
sorry,
let me,
Professor, but I made a mixed up. I made a blooper yet again. I actually prepared for Professor Shanhagen's talk and not for Professor Stephenson. I'll have to ask for apologies from him,
okay,
if
and
I
you,
may.
well, I understand that, but you could also just wing it.
Mm. Oh, with regard Professor Stevenson's lecture, I would say that I do agree with with the gist of his talk, that ultimately, um, whatever even if anti-corruption bodies are created, no matter how many they are, as with the experience in the Philippines, despite these good laws, despite these bodies, there are not really that many who were prosecuted for it or even convicted for it. Convicted, much less prosecuted for it. And it's all, in the end, it all boils down to political will. There's whatever law may be created, this will not substitute for political will on the part of the government.
Okay, let's stop there, Gali, because I want to get Maria in, and then we'll squeeze you in on the next panel. Uh, okay, so Ms. Maria, last but not least, can we hear from you?
Yes, Prof. Good afternoon, classmates. Good afternoon, Professor Stevenson and Professor Fitzpatrick. The point showing the challenges and possible solutions for fighting corruption worldwide actually resonated with me, because in debunking the quasi-myths, especially the belief that societies suffering from endemic corruption are hopeless, it is a breath of fresh air, especially when in the 2024 Corruption Perceptions Index by Transparency International, the Philippines actually ranked 114th out of the 180 countries, with zero being the least corrupt. We are tied with Sierra Leone, indicating a further decline in our previous standing. The flame of hope actually burns even brighter when the discourse provided a comparative and international perspective, as it made mention of different countries who succeeded in combating somehow corruption, albeit in excruciatingly slow periods. Nonetheless, in the first quasi-myths of corruption, corruption is generally considered abhorrent both in Western and non-Western countries. However, as Professor Stevenson have explained, some culture may have higher tolerance for it. A few questions comes to mind, however, with respect to the concept of tolerance. Is tolerance some sort of manifestation of a state capture, as discussed by Professor Shanhagan in his discourse on understanding and combating corruption, when in weak states such as transition economy state and post-conflict societies and those with pervasive organized crime, corruption is able to take place? I am likewise confused if the culture of tolerance is a byproduct of corrupt practices, or do existing cultural norms create an environment where corruption can take root, or do they mutually reinforce each other, or are they not related? Again, for quasi-myth number 3, it posits that there's nothing that can be done about an endemic corruption. This discourse is debunked, or this quasi-myth is debunked by showing that history shows otherwise and that a fatalistic attitude should not be adopted. But to my mind, this is true not only as shown by history, but because the anti-corruption reforms initiated throughout history that may have been successful in addressing corruption must have been able to identify where reform is most effective. Corruption, again, as defined by um, Junella Meadow, is a system. And like a system, as explained again by David Johnson in his paper, Building Anti-Corruption Resilience to Combat Entrenched Corruption Systems, is composed of three elements: the actors, the interconnections, and the functions. So David Johnson said that it is important to understand the actors involved in sectors corruption system networks, as these help practitioners who to keep an eye on and also who to maintain as allies. So social network analysis is a suggested tool by the authors. Further, Johnson added that anti-corruption efforts should engage with the reality of how corruption system operates. Understanding the expectations, codes, and informal rules that provide a supportive structure for this system can help make choices about the most feasible entry points for reform. Example that was cited by Johnson is Baez Camargo's anti-corruption work in the Tanzanian health sector. Finally, understanding the why likewise requires a sense of broader social and economic setting and the purposes that these systems serve. So moving forward, the discourse, especially on the four recommended models, seem to align with the economist James Buchanan's public choice theory also, in the sense that in both instances, the theory of whether to continue the cycle of corruption or to implement anti-corruption reforms are centered on the individual who eventually is capacitated to make the decision. In public choice theory, the driving force, again, behind the individual action is utility maximization. So one of the proposed models suggests that civil society groups, political entrepreneurs, or businesses are essentially individuals which are discontented with the current system. So these individuals may advocate for incremental reforms, thereby disrupting the vicious cycle of corruption and eventually changing the status quo to a virtuous cycle. Finally,
Okay.
both
Okay, go
perspectives.
ahead, Maria. That's great. You're doing great. But we should try to wrap up. But you're doing
Yes,
wonderful.
Professor. In what so both perspective underscore the decision that whether public or private are contingent on incentives presented to the decision maker. So in models 1 and 2, applying this to the Philippine setting, I am wondering about the Philippine experience during the COVID-19 crisis. Models number 1 and number 2 make specific mention of the strongman model, and the second is the crisis induced reform. So in the Philippines, during the COVID-19 crisis, we have the Bayanihan Act, which was enacted, and the president exercised emergency powers ostensibly to address the pandemic. However, this did not prevent corruption. After the pandemic, we have the Pharmaly scandal, which involved the emergency procurement of medical equipment and supplies. So I am wondering what factors might the Philippine experience have overlooked that facilitated corruption in this sense. So, in closing, the discourse has shown that while corruption appears to be a permanent feature of society, it is not immutable and there are ways to combat them. So, thank you again, Professor.
Okay. Well, thank you, Ms. Maria. That was quite a well stated and well prepared response as a panelist. I'm sure Professor Stevenson is, yes, he's even saying to me he's flattered and somewhat humbled by your remarks that brought in extra depth and richness to the discussion that he had not even thought to bring up, and he appreciates it very much. So thank you, Maria. I thought that was great. I hope some of this good thinking might go into some proposals for future academic work and perhaps even the paper I might see in the future. So that is really good. Congratulations. Okay, it is just a quick couple of points here. I very much appreciated the attachment to the application to the Philippines. Um, I very much appreciated how Maria um, spoke on parts that Professor Stevenson did not speak on, that we saw, that she was referring to parts before that. And I'm not saying that anyone else I'm not saying people just watch the ending part, but there's nothing wrong with talking as if he has done the entire speech, right? That's why you guys watched it beforehand. This is just this last part is just creating a sense of continuity for us. So let's take a break. We've had a nice beginning to this thing, and let's come back at 3:33. Okay, everybody, get your break, drink some water, and we'll be ready. We'll be ready to hear from Mr. Sean Hagan. Okay, our break is just about over. They're ringing the bell in the lobby outside the facility, so I see people coming back in. That's great to see. We're still waiting for a couple more. Particularly, I see Jan and Golly still out there talking, and oh, there you are. He's in now. Golly and Jan have come back. There's Noel. Believe everybody is back now. Let's just make sure. Yeah, it looks like we have a full house. So, great. I am already sharing a screen. Um, Before the break, we heard for about 15 minutes from Mr. Sean Hagan, who is coming to us from someplace in Europe. And we appreciate him getting up early in the morning for this to share his thoughts with us. And having discussed some of the impacts of corruption, is now going to share with us 6 lessons for designing an anti-corruption strategy. Um, we have 5 panelists as well, which I will reintroduce after we're done with Mr. Hagan's speech. Mr. Hagan says he will keep his remarks to a total of about 32 minutes, which means he has about 12 minutes left. So you can listen to Mr. Hagan. I note there's a little bit of a problem with our connection with the UK right now, so it's going to look a little bit, how should we say, foggy. Maybe it's a little foggy in jolly old England right now, and so maybe it's coming across on the slides. But you should be able to read along, especially if you have looked at his slides ahead of time, which all of you had. So without further ado, Mr. Hagan, Mr. Sean, can you hear me? Yeah, okay, he's coming through and he's ready to resume. Uh, Over to you, Mr. Hagan.
All right, so let's look at the lessons. First, I started working on this many years ago in Indonesia, and I came in there as a lawyer with all guns blazing about I'm going to put people in jail. And you realize that you can't construct an anti-corruption strategy by putting everybody in jail. You need to have a broader strategy, and one that relies on reforms that are actually not in and of themselves anti-corruption. They're broader regulatory reforms. And one way of looking at this is if you think of corruption as being a function of monopoly power plus discretion and accountability. So monopoly power, a good example of officials in society that have monopoly power are judges. And judges, as you know, when they're rendering decisions, they have a lot of discretion. And they don't have a lot of accountability because judges are final. So you put those 3 together, and it's not surprising that in systemically corrupt countries, the judges are often the most corrupt institution. Okay? So if you think about that, the way to address corruption is to work backwards, to reduce monopoly power, to reduce discretion, and increase accountability. Okay, so let's go on, next slide. For example, how do you increase accountability? Well, through transparency. You know, you require the government to essentially publish their revenues and their expenditures. And the IMF has its fiscal transparency code. And you also require transparency as to how countries manage their natural resources, where the contracts that are awarded have to be published, all licenses have to be published. And a final one is freedom of the press. You know, often corruption scandals, whether it be Lava Jato in Brazil or elsewhere, often are the catalyst for reform, where you can't have a scandal where there's no freedom of the press, because nobody finds out about it. So freedom of the press is really an important element of transparency. Civil service reform. This is critical because a lot of corruption that takes place, not just at the very senior level by ministers, but at the civil service level. And you know, there's a number of dimensions of reform here that are really important. One of them is simply requiring civil service to actually be able to do their job. Often, what they do is they want the job because it can become very remunerative because of bribes, and they're actually not qualified. So first of all, having clear performance management standards and dismissing them for misconduct. Actually, dismissal for misconduct is often a greater threat than actually prosecuting them in courts, because the court system is often corrupt. So, and also in some cases you have to increase remuneration. In many countries, corruption is actually an act of survival, not an act of venality. I mean, people need to basically do this in order to live. So there are examples of reforms where societies that were systemically corrupt were moved very quickly. Georgia is a very good example in 2000, and of course, Singapore under Lee Kuan Yew, and a major element of that was civil service reform. Okay. Reducing monopoly power. Remember, I had that little formula. So how do you reduce monopoly power? Well, one of the things you deregulate. In some cases, you know, in India, for example, you know, you need about 12 different licenses to open up a small retail store. Each of those stages is designed to provide an opportunity for someone to get a bribe. So simplifying regulation can actually be a way of depriving public officials from extracting bribes. In some cases, you legalize. You actually, it's not just you simplify, you legalize. A good example of that is prohibition in the United States. And I think, you know, prohibition is a really good example because prior to prohibition, the US didn't really have a big problem of corruption, either in the police or in the judiciary or in the civil service. It exploded with prohibition, right? Why? Well, because essentially there was now a substance that was illegal that the entire population wanted, right? So therefore, everybody was willing to be bribed. I mean, everybody was a potential bribor. And essentially that's what happened. It went all the way up to all the way up to the top to the Attorney General's office. How did they resolve it? Well, they legalized alcohol, right? And you know, so that's a good example. And you know, many people argued that the same should be done with gambling. And some people would say the same thing should be done with certain drugs. I'm not going into that debate. All I'm saying is that in some cases, legalization is necessary. So another dimension is reducing discretion. And you can do that by technology. In other words, you can have regulation where the licenses and permits are done online. In other words, you remove the human actor in the transaction. And it becomes a much more transparent and simpler license application process. And some countries have really use this as a cornerstone in addressing corruption. South Korea, Georgia, Estonia, if you look at Estonia's sort of e-government movement, a big motivation is getting rid of corruption. Second lesson, context matters. So even though I generally think that deregulation is important, in some cases, you may need the opposite. Remember I mentioned regulatory capture? When the private sector controls the regulators, in those cases, you need to strengthen the role of regulators, not shrink it, okay? And that's one of the big issues. We saw it in the Asian financial crisis and also in Central Eastern Europe. Okay, next. Lesson 3. When corruption is systemic, it is generally a political problem, not a technical one. And this was something that I learned the hard way. We tend to think, well, if we just train the judges better, if we just educated the civil servants better, if we just make them our partners, it doesn't work that way, because even though the international community actually knows how to help countries, all these best practices, the IMF Fiscal Transparency Standard, the EITI, unless the domestic conditions for reform are in place, it's not going to happen. Because when corruption is systemic, there are many losers, but there's a few winners. And their economic power normally translates into political power, and they're not going to give it up. So you need to have the domestic conditions for reform. Sometimes it can happen gradually. It happened gradually in the United States. Some of you may know this, but the US had one of the most corrupt civil services in the 19th century. And the private sector got fed up with it, because as the private sector became more important, they relied on public services, the post, whatever. And eventually they demanded that there be a professional civil service that gave rise to the Pendleton Act of 1883. Some of you may know that President Garfield was assassinated by someone who felt that, notwithstanding the contributions, that financial contributions he had made, he hadn't received a good enough job. So the other example, though, is crises. Crises can also, political crises can drive corruption. And I think an excellent example, one where I was involved, was the 1998 financial crisis in the fall of Suharto. That was very much, the slogan was corupție, coluzie, nepotism, corruption, collusion, and nepotism. That was the rallying cry that basically toppled Suharto. Lesson 4, democracy and corruption. It's a complicated relationship. In some cases, it actually helps tremendously. And because it delivers accountability, right? In that formula, it increases accountability, and it can be critical. And actually, Indonesia is a very good example. The real breakthrough in the anti-corruption movement in Indonesia was the election of Bambang Yudhoyono in 2004. Also, Saakashvili in 2004 in Georgia. But on the other hand, you have many countries that are democratic that happily have large amounts of corruption. India is a good example. It doesn't do very well on any of the indicators. And in some cases, it can actually make it worse. In the US, it was a major driver of patronage, where politicians basically offered jobs for votes. And in Greece, many argue it's the same today. One of the reasons why people argue Greece has such a large civil service is because politicians would offer jobs for votes. And it also consolidates state capture by the private sector. And a lot has been written on this by people like Anders Aslund on Ukraine. But some people would argue that this is exactly what we have in the United States, where we have a situation where voters are effectively bribing the legislatures through the current campaign finance system. Okay. Lesson 5, measurement is a real problem. Since it's hidden, it's difficult to obtain direct evidence. I mean, how do you determine? If you look at the number of prosecutions, well, if prosecutions are low, that might mean actually there's a lot of corruptions. So you don't know, so it's difficult so you need to come up with perceptions and experience of corruption And there's a number of indicators that do that. My own view is you need to look at many proxies like fiscal transparency, tax efficiency, as a way of measuring it. And what's important is that you come up with these frameworks and you apply them rigorously, because otherwise there's a risk that when countries like the United States roll out their anti-corruption, they cherry pick and they are very strict with countries that are not strategic allies, but give strategic allies a free pass. Surprise, surprise. Okay? Lesson 6. Advanced economies are part of the problem. So everything I've spoken about now relates to countries that are systemically corrupt. But those countries often become that way in part because of other countries. A good example is foreign bribery. These officials in many of these extractive resources economies are bribed by multinationals. And what's critical is these advanced economies need to crack down on what we call the supply side. In other words, large multinationals in countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and elsewhere, who are the hosts of countries that of companies that bribe foreign officials. But then on the other side, you will not be surprised that these oligarchs, these ministers, they don't invest their money in their home countries. They invest it elsewhere. They invested in the financial system. They invested in the property market in London. And of course, there is a lot that has been talked about that. And they're known as politically exposed persons, which I think is a great euphemism. And there's a whole legal and institutional framework in place that the international community has adopted to basically require countries to crack down on this type of concealment. And the US has just basically enacted a very important law that allows the US to go beyond shell companies. The biggest problem, like everything else, is enforcement. And I think that's actually one of the issues in the United Kingdom right now when we talk about what's going on with the oligarchs in Russia, is there is the unexplained wealth order. I mean, the UK has the tools. The question is the extent to which they're willing to enforce it. And I think with that, that's it.
Thank you very much, Sean.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Sean Hagan. That was a very interesting talk. It sounded like you would have some things you would agree with Professor Stevenson, but I will leave those kind of comments to our panelists. And let's hear from our five panelists. We have Fevianne Gador, we have Beverly Tan, we have Mary Basado Dulai, Amy Floro, and Gali Dolnuan. So let's hear from Ms. Fevi. What did you think? What's your thoughts? What about the Philippines?
Good day, everyone. So thank you, Professor Hagan, for a very insightful and solution-driven presentation. So Professor Hagan's discussion regarding designing an anti-corruption strategy for an institution which is systemically corrupt is of most interest to me as someone who has been working with the civil society for a call for policy reform. As pointed out, in designing an anti-corruption strategy, reformists should consider the fact that corruption is a function of monopoly plus discretion minus accountability. Some argue that certain provisions in the Philippine Constitution, particularly those related to political dynasties and economic regulation, can indirectly facilitate the rise and maintenance of oligarchic power. While this may be true, however, I would like to focus more on the reduction of an almost unchecked exercise of discretion of public officials, which facilitate more rent-seeking activities in the Philippines. I know there are so many things to unpack, but I would focus on that. I would argue that through our existing legal framework, we somewhat has institutionalized administrative corruption by failing to provide a limitation or even restrictions on the term or concept of exercise of discretion in our laws. The Supreme Court has interpreted this concept in several ways over the past decades. Our existing legal framework is actually a manifestation of the Filipinos' attitude toward corruption and how certain types of administrative corruption has become acceptable. I would like to add to the discussion the type of enabling environment the Philippines have, which make the culture of corruption difficult but not necessarily impossible to combat. In one of Professor Hagan's talk that is in Oxford, he mentioned that he does agree that corruption may be cultural. Some countries are more corrupt than others. Professor Stephenson pointed out that there are cultural differences in how a country may perceive an activity as constituting corruption. The generally accepted definition is that there is corruption when there is abuse of public office for public gain, or if there is abuse of entrusted power for private gain. Philippine penal laws and even its rules governing the conduct of government officials are replete with provisions that would show how corruption or the appearance of corruption, at least the smaller scale, that is administrative and bureaucratic corruption to some degree has been accepted as the norm of conduct. Professor Hagan mentioned about the gray areas. Our distinguished guest asked if there are certain abuses of offices which are not criminalized. Here in the Philippines, we do have the concept of allowable abuse of discretion of some government officials given executive, administrative, or judicial powers. Meaning to say, they can neither be held criminally or administratively liable, even if there was abuse of discretion in the exercise of their governmental function. To cite an example, grave misconduct of a public official is defined as an unwillful intent to violate the law, or a flagrant disregard of a willful intent to violate the law, or a flagrant disregard of an established rule. Many public officials who wield awesome discretionary power in the granting of licenses and permits, such as municipal mayors, are not sanctioned even if it was proven that the public official transgressed the rules and regulations in the issuance of licenses or permits, if it would not be shown that the transgression was a mere abuse of discretion, not attended with bad faith and malice. Awesome discretionary powers in the implementation of complex regulations, in the issuance of licenses and permits, provide for opportunities for rent seeking. Our penal laws do have provisions, Article 210 on direct bribery, that would absolve public officials of criminal liability even if they accepted a price or reward for the commission of an act which is not criminal, so long as it is not unjust. The Anti-Graft and Corrupt Practices Act do not address the fact that corruption in the Philippines is systemic and that political patronage should be dismantled. Thus, when a public official, say a provincial governor, grants political favor to his political allies in the form of donation of government properties, this is not considered criminal per se if the public official can establish that what was considered was the interest of the public. Our legal framework on corruption would show how the Philippine society view corruption, or at least some forms of corruption. It is part of the culture, and one of the ways of combating it is through broader regulatory frameworks. That is the part of Professor Hagan's discussion that I actually agree with.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that, Fevi. I very much appreciate your tying this all into Philippine legal frameworks, and specifically with regard to potential for dynasties, and the discretion wielded under various laws by public officials, and the potential for abuse that comes with it. That connects very quickly to, or very well, with Professor Hagan's notion about his functionality of monopoly plus discretion minus accountability equals likelihood of corruption, which is something that we brought up several times in our own class. Okay, I'd like to move on to the next on our list, Ms. Beverly Tan. I'd love to hear from you.
Good afternoon, Prof. Good afternoon, classmates. And thank you, Sir Hagan, for that insightful discussion. So I'll focus on lesson 4, that while democracy can play an important role in addressing corruption, it is not a panacea. So as discussed by Sir Hagan, same with India, democracy coexists with corruption in the Philippines. So from the time the election period begins, vote buying and vote selling become rampant. So people sell their right to suffrage, thus democracy is not seen to be addressing corruption in the country. Despite policies implemented and penalties imposed, people still engaged to vote buying and vote selling. So this became a practice and was for a long time considered as normal. So if one can observe, politicians who is running for the first time emphasize that they have no corruption records. This is to portray that they are different and to win the hearts of the people. However, since corruption became normal, many politicians here in the Philippines who claim that they are not corrupt failed to secure a seat. So it is important to know what factors allow democracy to coexist with corruption in the Philippines to address such problem. So the coexistence of democracy and corruption in the Philippines can be attributed to several factors. So one of the factors is weak institutions, so such as lack of effective checks and balances and ineffective law enforcement. So weak institutions and inadequate checks and balances can enable corrupt practices to thrive. And inadequate law enforcement and weak prosecution can allow corrupt individuals to act with impunity. So another factor is patronage politics. So this patronage politics, where politicians provide favors and benefits to supporters in exchange for loyalty and votes, can foster corruption. Another factor is electoral system, such as money politics and dynastic politics. The high cost of electoral campaigns can lead to corruption, as politicians may seek to recoup their investment through corrupt means. And also the prevalence of dynastic politics where family members hold multiple positions of power, which can contribute to corruption. Another factor is socio-cultural factors, cultural attitudes toward corruption, which wherein certain cultural attitudes such as tolerance for petty corruption or acceptance of gifts from public officials can perpetuate corrupt practices here in the Philippines. And also, limited civic engagement and lack of awareness about corruption can hinder efforts to hold public officials accountable. Another factor is economic factors, of course, such as poverty and equality and economic opportunities. Because poverty and inequality can create an environment where corruption thrives, as individuals may feel compelled to engage in corrupt practices to survive or improve their economic situation. Of course, the availability of economic opportunities and resources can create opportunities for corruption, particularly in industries such as construction or extractives. Last factor is the historical legacy. Because the Philippines, as its colonial history, has shaped its institution and governance, contributing to the persistence of corruption. Also, the country's experience with authoritarian rule has also contributed to the normalization of corruption and abuse of power. So these factors interact and reinforce each other, making it challenging to eradicate corruption in the Philippines. So I agree with Sir Hagan that addressing corruption requires a comprehensive approach that involves institutional reforms, civic engagement, and cultural shift. That's all.
Okay, well, thank you, Ms. Beverly. That was a very nice application of the factors to the Philippines. Very good, bravo. All right, we're moving on to Ms. Mary.
Good day, Prof. Hagan. I deeply appreciated your presentation, which offered a powerful synthesis of institutional and political economic insights into corruption, especially those regarding rentier states, regulatory capture, and the strategic use of crisis as reform windows. However, I'd like to raise one critical point that I feel was underexplored. It is the role of the transaction cost theory and middlemen in facilitating corruption within the government hierarchies, most especially in low and middle income countries like the Philippines. So applying Cose's theory of the firm, it helps us understand why bureaucracies emerge to reduce transaction costs. So in weak institutions, these hierarchies themselves can become rent-seeking machines, and corrupt actors internal to the bureaucracy may not just passively accept bribes, but they actively create barriers to extract rent. So they often manufacture complexity, delay, and opacity. In other words, if inefficiency then becomes a business model. So this dynamic is particularly evident in the Philippines, where corruption frequently runs through the middle layers of governance rather than just flowing down from the top of the pyramid. So the common examples would be those kotong systems in the Philippines regarding those licensing and those institutional use of the fixers for navigating red tape measures and conversions of procurement funds, which again are systematically siphoned through the intermediaries. So while the presentation rightly draws on Indonesia and Ukraine to illustrate systematic corruption, our context shows institutionalized informal frameworks and middlemen sustain these frameworks from within. So this is especially true when agents operate in systems where the principals either tolerate again or benefit from those distortions. As a related point, you rightly warned against over relying on criminal prosecution because as I quote, you can't build an anti-corruption strategy around putting everyone in jail. So as discussed, in designing the anti-corruption strategy, the first lesson is to avoid placing excessive reliance on criminal prosecution, as legal prosecution is slow, politically constrained, and often ineffective in countries where the judiciary itself is compromised. So as I quote, you have the equation that corruption again is equal to monopoly power plus discretion and accountability, where, as I also quote, you made a good example of officials in society like judges who, when they render decisions, they have a lot of discretion and they don't have accountability. And when those things put together, it's not surprising that, as you said, it is in systematically corrupt countries, the judges often are the most often corrupt institution. So thus a more pragmatic approach lies in a strategic administrative reforms, and this include performance-based evaluations or those audit trails and the timely dismissal of those non-performing or abusive civil servants. So such reform reduce both discretion and opportunities for rent extraction without relying on the judicial processes that can be weaponized or even stalled. So this lesson is particularly relevant in the Philippine setting, again, where even high-profile corruption cases are delayed for years in the courts or even are overturned through just procedural loopholes within the Civil Service Commission. So as I also noted, that the common corruption metrics, as you have stated in lesson 5, such perception or indices and financial transparency scores often fail to capture the actual and operational mechanics of corruption. I strongly agree with that. So in practice, tools like micro-level audit trails or real-time monitoring and even the e-procurement systems, they offer more practical and actionable insights as to reform. So these technologies are increasingly feasible even for developing countries like the Philippines. And crucially, I must recognize also your point in recognizing that the freedom of expression is not merely a democratic ideal, but a functional necessity in combating production. So independent media and whistleblowers and civil societies organizations, they play a pivotal role in exposing corrupt practices and holding people to account. So, however, in the Philippines, these actors really often face significant threats, including legal harassment or censorship, and even violence and death. So, as a notable case would be the with journalist Maria Ressa and the news outlet with Rampler. So it exemplifies the challenges faced by those who dare to speak to power. However, I don't want to deep dive into that particular controversy. So overall, I agree that protecting and promoting freedom of expression is therefore integral to any effective anti-corruption strategy.
Okay, well, Mary,
Thank you.
that was very impressive coming out of, usually you sometimes didn't talk as much in the previous classes, but here you go ahead and just hit the ball out of the park. That was really good. What I really appreciate is your wrapping or raising issues that weren't even brought up necessarily by the speakers, but were brought up in our class, like the reliance on middlemen and fixers. Brilliant. Very good. Um, I very much like the fact that you are taking concepts that were brought up in the class over the last 5 months or so and pulling them in and making sense of them and synthesizing them with other perspectives. That shows me that you are really embracing the approaches that I had hoped to teach in this class. And, I will say this, while I like what everyone's saying, a lot of you are drawing from your Philippine experience as much as you are drawing from the class, and perhaps even more so. If I had to say, a lot of you having great insights about the Philippine situation, and you're applying what's been said in the class to the Philippine situation, in these speeches to the Philippine situation. But remember, when we come down to our papers, and it's okay now, everyone's been doing a great job. Remember, the key here is just not to go with what's comfortable with what you know, what you've heard. Try to go with something that's a little bit less comfortable, and taking on some of these ideas that we've been learning that maybe you don't necessarily feel expert on yet, but take a chance and work with those ideas and try to bring them in to your papers. You will do much better, and I'm willing to work with you to make that better if you go down that direction. I remember, I'm jumping ahead of ourselves, but I just remember last semester, I went over these things, and it's amazing how much I tried to talk about it ahead of time, and I still saw that when it was time to write those papers, they still fell back to the things that felt comfortable to them. So let's try to avoid that. I know we have two more speakers, but we can probably go a little bit over time. We could the chef says that they're a little behind on dinner, so let's hear from on preparing dinner. So let's hear from Amy while that's all going on.
Good afternoon, Professor. Good afternoon, classmates. Good afternoon, Professor Hagan. Thank you for that brilliant lecture on lessons that we can incorporate in anti-corruption strategies. So there are 2 points that I wanted to discuss. The first one is what Professor Hagan discussed in his Oxford lecture. Professor Hagan said that often regulatory environment exists to provide opportunity for rent seeking, that we should be cautious with the culture of compliance as a solution to corruption. The other thing that perhaps I wanted to have heard in relation to regulatory environment is lobbying and agency capture. So because we have learned from this course that businesses are influential interest group that can change policies for their benefit through lobbying, and how lobbyists control information and expertise that change policies for their benefit. I think it is important to have a better understanding of that and how to draw a line or a boundary between a mere lobbying to agency capture. That is very important, particularly in the Philippines, because there is a push for privatization of some of the government services. So we've seen privatization of transportation, roads and highways, waste disposal, and this is through a public and private partnership, or PPP. So as an insight to this, as an application to what we've heard from Professor Hagan, is that I hope he will agree with me that transparency is crucial when it comes to public and private partnership transactions, auditing as well, both financially and on operational level, and the free press. So in order to scrutinize the operation and the relationship between the implementing agency and the private enterprise running the operation. So the second point that I wanted to discuss is that I think both Professor Hagan and Professor Stephenson agree that corruption is political. And Professor Hagan, in his Oxford lecture, said that when corruption becomes systemic, it undermines the capacity of the state to perform its key function, and one of which is the fiscal function of the government, or its ability to raise revenue and to spend it well. So I think it is not just applicable to revenues coming from the taxes, but also revenues coming from the government-owned and controlled corporations, the state-run corporations doing a proprietary function of the government. And in applying the lessons coming from Professor Hagan. I think, again, transparency and publication and free press are important, but I wanted to add that a good judiciary is also crucial. One very good example of this is the recent controversy regarding the Philippine Health Insurance Corporation, or PhilHealth, wherein there is an effort to transfer billions of pesos of money from PhilHealth to the National Treasury in order to finance unprogrammed priority projects of the government. So basically, there is a distortion of expenses because PhilHealth fund should supposed to pay or fund for healthcare of individual Filipinos, but here we are, they are getting they're siphoning the funds from PhilHealth to the National Treasury in order to fund priority projects or other projects of the government. So I like that Professor Hagan said that because of there is distortion of priorities, it exacerbates poverty and inequality. And I think, if I may add, it also costs people's lives. So hopefully, I wanted to learn more or heard from Professor Hagan. How do we transform our political system? How do we change the attitude of Filipinos in order to elect good officials who will push for anti-corruption reform? That's all, Professor.
Okay. Well, Amy, thank you so much for that. I liked how you brought in, again, new ideas that weren't brought up. The line between agency capture and lobbying, very good. And I liked very much how you went beyond, or not went beyond, amplified some of the points that Professor Hagan talked about, transparency and some of the impacts of corruption. So thank you very much for that. We have to hear from Gali, who is a surprise panelist for this one. So Gali, would love to hear from you.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Hagan, your imperceptive discussion of the 6 anti-corruption strategies you learned in the course of your work with the IMF in combating corruption, particularly its shift toward governance conditionality, raises questions about institutional design, transaction costs, and trust in economic systems. Drawing on foundational ideas from Ronald Coase, if I may explore how his analysis intersects with these frameworks and where tensions may arise. Ronald Coase's work on transaction costs suggests that efficient outcomes can emerge if the costs of negotiation are low. However, corruption, especially in state institutions, create prohibitive transaction costs, distorting markets and undermining accountability. You described the IMF's governance mandates, that is, such as its anti-corruption reforms, as efforts to reduce these costs by realigning incentives. But Coase might question whether the IMF, as an external actor, can truly internalize the social costs of corruption without local buy-in. In contexts where local institutions have weak enforcement capabilities, do these concessions create inefficiencies that ultimately undermine their intended benefits? In weak institutional environments, bargaining fails due to asymmetric power, rent seeking, and lack of legal resource. Here, your emphasis on transparency aligns with Ronald Coase's implicit call for low friction institutions, but I am not sure that the IMF's leverage may be sufficient to overcome entrenched oligarchs, like here in the Philippines. Moving on, your lecture brought to mind Francis Fukuyama's talk on governance and corruption, published sometime in 2014, which I happened to access on YouTube, where he cautioned that rules alone cannot substitute for organic trust building. In a sense, he advanced the view that corruption is a symptom of a low-trust society. Between your view that governance reforms often fail when these are perceived to have been imposed by external bodies like the IMF, and the trust gap mentioned by Professor Fukuyama, can the IMF's approach be endangered if it's perceived to have bypassed domestic consensus? My personal view is that the IMF's conditions may look optimal on paper, but these may not translate well when it comes to implementation because of the low level of trust that people have toward government institutions. Take, for instance, the IMF's push back in 2018 for a national ID system here in the Philippines. This was supposedly to stall welfare fraud, but it kept getting stalled by privacy issues and contractor problems, which which just illustrates how local politics can derail these conditionalities. If I may say so, your framework could benefit from integrating Ronald Coase's pragmatism with Professor Fukuyama's realism. That is, the IMF might focus on reducing discrete transactions rather than broadly overhauling governance while advocating anti-corruption efforts that work on increasing or improving culturally embedded trust building, such as by supporting local civil society efforts against corruption over top-down conditionality. So drawing from your extensive work with the IMF, if I may ask, what can be a context-sensitive approach that could work to curb systemic corruption here in the Philippines? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Gali. I appreciate several things here in this in your response, bringing in the thoughts from Professor Kos and also from Mr. Fukuyama, which was I was not necessarily expecting that. That was impressive. I like that very much. Your point about the external pressure that IMF puts on countries and your call for perhaps a different emphasis is interesting. Some of that work was done by USAID, actually, that, the emphasis is supporting um, civil society in the fight against corruption was oftentimes supported by the USAID and other organizations like the ADB, and sometimes they got in big trouble for it. Sometimes they drew the wrath of the powers that were necessarily being threatened by that. In fact, I personally recall a project I was on called back in the Philippines called Agile, where several people were brought up, and a good friend of mine, in fact, were brought up in front of the Senate of the Philippines and questioned about their undue influence in the government. And that was all designed to stop what was then an attack on the monopoly or the near monopoly held by Philippine Airlines. So anyhow, that's a story for another day. But thank you for that. That was good, and I'm glad I had you. We switched you over to this panel for the last one. Okay, it is now. Look at this, perfect timing. We'll be able to have a nice sit down for a nice meal or a cocktail beforehand, and then have a nice meal, and then we could have our speaker, Miss Coberly, discuss some other issues and perhaps take a slightly different approach than the other two speakers. So let's take some time to go off and go find our seats and start eating. And then we'll come back and we'll have Ms. Coberly after we've started our coffee or after the main course, and she'll be talking about a few things important to her and probably relevant to our class. So see you all at, I'd say 4:35. Okay, it's 4:21 right now. Enjoy your first and second courses, and we'll talk to you soon. Okay, I want to take a quick photo. Is everybody with us at this point? I think so. Golly, you with us? There we go. All right, so everybody just smile. Let's get a nice picture for the yearbook or whatever we're doing. Thank you very much. All right. I hope everyone enjoyed their meal. We have with us Ms. Carolyn Coberly, who is right now teaching at the Virginia Commonwealth University, and also at one point was studying at the University of Virginia. So she and I have been in the same university, though not necessarily the same batch. So Ms. Coberly will be talking about anti-corruption policy. And we may have heard some of her speaking before, and we'll be hearing from two of our panelists, Ms. Feve and Mr. Noel, after she finished speaking. Because this is an 8-minute speech, we're going to hear the entirety of her talk, and then we'll go to the panelists. And make sure if you can hear her sound, give me a thumbs up, okay? I'm pretty sure the sound should work. Okay, stop. I know what I'm doing wrong. I haven't shared the screen correctly, so hang on a second. Ms. Caroline, Professor Caroline, wait a minute, or if you bear with us, it's my problem on technical side. Give me a minute.
As a collective action or principal agent problem. In this video, I use these models to discuss different ways to reduce corruption. I describe different ways to resolve collective action and principal agent problems, using examples of anti-corruption reforms to illustrate them, and I comment on how well each type of reform has worked. As a reminder, we can think of corruption as a principal agent problem in the sense that someone is not fulfilling their expected responsibilities. In the case of low-level or petty corruption, a bureaucrat is not doing their duty to provide services without bribes, for example. Or in the case of high-level or grand corruption, a leader is not fulfilling their responsibility to protect the public interest. Corruption can also be a collective action problem in the sense that if it is prevalent throughout society, if it is a norm, then it becomes rational to engage in corrupt practices. These distinctions make a difference because they imply different solutions to the problem of corruption. If corruption is a principal agent problem, then it can be changed by changing people's incentives. But if corruption is a collective action problem, then you need to change overall norms. Institutional change can often help with both. Let's go into detail. Principal agent problems are often resolved by changing individual cost-benefit calculation. You can give people more incentives to do what you want and higher penalties if they don't do what you want. In the context of corruption, increasing bureaucrats' basic pay scales reduces their incentive to ask for bribes, while prosecuting corruption cases increases the individual cost of engaging in corrupt practices. Similarly, since principal agent problems are at core about contract violations, you can also resolve them by monitoring the agent more closely. Just as you can at least try to make sure a contractor working on a home renovation does not run over their cost estimate by checking on their performance regularly, you can also allow more monitoring of the performance of government officials. The most common way to do this is by requiring asset declarations. In many countries, high-level government officials need to submit forms available to the public where they state how many houses they own, which stocks they trade in, things like that. This makes it possible for people to see if officials have incomes much higher than their government salaries, or are profiting off inside information. Finally, one of the most effective ways to resolve a principal agent problem is by changing the agent. Corrupt officials benefit by staying in their jobs because they are able to build networks of allies, patrons, and clients of their own. Rotating bureaucrats through different offices every few years can reduce corruption by breaking those networks. And when a leader is a source of corruption in a country, elections that allow for a change in office can similarly remove the problem. The new officials or leaders may not be any more honest than the old ones, but the change at least means that the new officials need time to build up new corrupt networks. So which of these actually work? There is strong evidence that raising salaries and rotation work very well at reducing corruption in a country. The main problem with these policies is that they are difficult to implement. Salary increases may be beyond the means of lower-income countries that collect little in government revenue, and rotating mid-level staff can similarly be expensive, requiring additional training or relocation expenses. The benefits of rotating leaders show both why democratic institutions can reduce corruption and why it's hard to make that work. One reason why corruption is low in established democracies is because they regularly change leadership. But corruption is often very high in new or weak democracies. And in those cases, corruption undermines this aspect of democracy by allowing leaders to use their ill-gotten gains to swing votes in their favor and never lose elections. Finally, there is actually little evidence that monitoring alone reduces corruption. Asset declarations can actually backfire by making everyone realize how common corruption is. This creates a collective action problem. They tend to only work when paired with a free media that can read and interpret declarations, as well as an independent judicial system that can evaluate whether they were truthful and prosecute violations. Similarly, prosecutions can be effective, but tend to require systemic change, as I'll discuss in a moment. Collective action problems can also be resolved by changing cost-benefit calculations. This is the main point of state institutions in the first place, after all, to create a penalty for not contributing taxes to a public good. But they can also be resolved through information sharing and creating focal points for action. We'll talk about collective action in its traditional sense, organizing protests and social movements, in a few weeks. But creating an information cascade, where you tip public opinion on an issue, like the possibility of a democratic transition, by widely sharing information, is one of the most common ways to resolve them. Unfortunately, as with transparency and monitoring, information sharing alone rarely resolves collective action problems related to corruption. Public awareness campaigns against corruption rarely have an impact, either because, again, they make corruption look more prominent, or because the public already knows that corruption is a problem and is wrong. Even successful awareness-raising campaigns, like I Paid a Bribe in India, which created an app for people to report on officials who ask for bribes, often only have a short-term effect. Usage of the site has declined significantly since its peak in 2011. As with all awareness-raising campaigns, they tend to only result in change when accompanied by institutional reform. And that's where thinking of corruption as a collective action problem can be helpful. When reformers are trying to generate collective action, to get an information cascade going, they don't just start anywhere. They start at what are called focal points, building on a key idea, person, event, or organization that can generate support more quickly. If we're talking about a political protest, organizers might choose a symbolic date to hold the protest on to get more public attention. In the context of anti-corruption reform, what this means is choosing key institutions to reform first. Prosecuting officials for corruptions requires investigators to identify cases, trained prosecutors to bring legal cases against them, and independent judges who are willing to try those cases, amongst other things. Since the regular legal system is often a source of corruption, those seeking reform will often create a separate institution to bundle these functions together and prosecute not just one high-profile corruption case, but many. For example, in the early 2000s, Indonesia established the Corruption Eradication Commission, or KPK, which had investigative and prosecutorial powers to conduct sting operations against corrupt officials. It succeeded in part because of support from civil society, international pressure, its expansive powers, and a smart strategy. It started with prosecutions of mid-level officials. This built public support based on its effectiveness, without alienating the powers that be. This then put it in a very strong position to later successfully prosecute high-level officials, including judges and relatives of the president. So that's the idea behind a focal point. You choose and empower an initial set of institutions for reform, then build upon that success to change not just public opinion, but private practice. So again, this has been a quick introduction to anti-corruption policy. The key things to remember are that the model you use to define corruption in a country, what you think the causes of corruption are, will shape what policies you choose to implement to correct it. But choose carefully. Changing incentive structures can work for specific cases of corruption, particularly when you can remove leaders. But increasing monitoring alone rarely reduces endemic corruption. Rather, it's often necessary to implement comprehensive institutional reform, starting with key functions like prosecutions or contracting, and building support from there. In my
Thank you very much, Ms. Coberly. That was a very enlightening speech to presentation to offer us as we're finishing up our meal. I'm sure everyone appreciated that. What I'd like to do now is bring it over to our panelists. We have two of them for you. And we will be starting with, in this case, Miss Fabienne Gador. Thank you, Miss Fevy, for taking time away from finishing your meal to share some food for thought for us as we respond to Miss Carolyn Coberly.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Ms. Coberly, for a very concise and easy to follow presentation regarding the different models of corruption and how it would actually affect our decision regarding the policies that we would be creating or drafting in the future. So I am most interested in your view pertaining to the principal agent problem as a corruption model. I noticed that the solution is focused on correcting the behavior of the agent, while in many instances, corrupt transactions may occur due to an agent's deviation from his duty of fidelity and his prioritizing of his personal interest. However, this perspective may have undermined the fact that the principal may also be the cause of the corrupt activities, as pointed out in our class and as pointed out also by De Dios and Ferrer in their paper Corruption in the Philippines, Framework and Context, that both the principal and the agent can act in a corrupt manner. And in those instances, the principal may not be invested in correcting and monitoring the agent's behavior. So the rational choice theory posits that individuals make decisions by weighing the costs and benefits, ultimately choosing the course of action that best aligns with their self-interest or personal preferences. However, we note that in countries with uninformed voters, politicians can bribe their way to office through vote buying, among many other things. Hence, for the informed voters, there is not much of an incentive to monitor the agent's behavior under the rational choice theory. I also find it interesting that you consider grand corruption schemes as a byproduct of a principal agent problem. Grand corruption schemes are characterized by systematic and large-scale schemes. And for both Professor Stephenson and Hagan, essentially, systematic corruption or systemic corruption is essentially a collective action problem that should be addressed through institutional and regulatory reform. So I'm very interested in the differences and if there's a possibility to reconcile that, if there is. You also mentioned that if you view corruption as a collective action problem, instances wherein corruption has already become the norm, the solution would not be anymore to just merely change or correct the incentive structure, so the incentive structure pertaining to the agent, but to change the norms, basically regulatory and institutional reforms. One of your proposed solutions is the creation of an investigative and prosecutorial agency or commission similar to KPK in Indonesia. We are curious as to your take, or I am personally curious as to your take on how systematically corrupt countries would be able to ensure that this prosecutorial agency would not be hijacked by the same elites who had already captured the state. You've also mentioned that in highly democratic countries or democratic countries, I'm just paraphrasing here, that the instances of corruption is low as compared to weak states. However, according to Professor Hagan, democracy may actually exacerbate corruption. So by when the elite has already captured the state institutions, or when the voting populace is actually uninformed. So that would be all. Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Fevy, thank you very much for bringing up such good points with regard to Ms. Coverly. I think, um, well, we appreciated what Ms. Coverly brought on. Speaking, amongst us, it might appear a little bit on the simplistic side, but nevertheless, it was packaged well. Something to um, gave us food for thought, but at the same time, perhaps at the expense of nuance. But that's okay. But I appreciate your slicing and dicing some of her points in a way that was both respectful but insightful. Okay, now we're going to hear from Mr. Noel to move to also respond to Ms. Coberly.
Thank you, Ms. Coverly. Thank you, Professor. My co-panelists had already dissected the lecture of Ms. Coverly, but I have some observations as far as the suggested or the recommended anti-corruption policies presented are concerned. As to the increase of salaries of civil servants, we have already in the Philippines implemented the salary standardization law, and still corruption is a problem. And as far as rotation is concerned, when it comes to rotation of bureaucrats or public officials, there may be problem because of the nature or the concept of security of tenure of government employees and officials. But I'm more interested in the collective action problem because Ma'am Coverly had suggested that there could be change in the institution, change in the culture, as well as the other one is changing incentives. As far as culture is concerned, there are some notable cultures in the Philippines that facilitate corruption, like when we talk about the utang na loob. Palabra de honor, I think, is one word that or one phrase that they use this. And it has something to do with the returning favor from favor that has been granted in the past. And most of the politicians would make use of this in perpetuating nepotism, relatives, etc., even bribery and extortion in government because of the utang na loob or palabra de honor system. And we also know that nepotism is highly influenced by the so-called blood is thicker than water principle. These are very, let me say, ingrained concepts in the Philippine society that really facilitates corruption. I'm, of course, appreciative of the explanation of Ma'am Coverly regarding information cascade, because I think that's what's really needed. Even in schools, from the basic education system, the values against corruption, against immoral acts in government should be taught to our students. Our teachers must also be educated regarding corruption and how to combat corruption. Even the ordinary citizen must also be given the proper information regarding corruption, because in some areas of our locality, you could hear statements like, well, this guy is corrupt but at least he delivers. He gave benefits. He implemented projects in our society or in our community. So we will vote for him in the next election, even if we know that he's corrupt. That should change. And Ma'am Coverly, just like the question that I asked from regarding the lecture of Professor Stevenson, I'd like to ask, do you agree that corruption is a crime against humanity so that these corrupt officials could be brought to the International Criminal Court so that they would be prosecuted because they have committed crimes against humanity? I think that's the most important question that I'm asking now, Professor. Thank you for the.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Knoll, with that, with your second round of being a panelist. That is very nice. I do note that there have been a bunch of questions here, and it's funny that you end with this. Since that was the first question that was brought up. And you asked the question of whether or not the I think I just lost Noel. Noel has let's see if I can bring him back in. Noel, there you go. He's back. Okay. No, we lost you for a second just as I was addressing your question,
Yeah.
so I waited until you got back. No, I
Thank you.
don't. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if the speakers as well know the answer about whether or not corruption is considered a human rights issue that would rise to bringing somebody before the International Criminal Court. You mentioned the crime against humanity. I have to say, I wish I knew more about the ICC's actual jurisdictional mandate. And I know for a fact this is very, very controversial. Former President Duterte's basically being hauled in front of the ICC, and whether that's justified. Certainly, some people would not look at this as a corruption problem necessarily, but instead uh, extrajudicial killings kind of issue. And I think I don't know exactly what the indictment was for President Duterte, but I would imagine there's some discussion of that, and that might have been the major point. If I don't believe corruption has risen to a level of a crime against humanity, but perhaps ordering many allegedly ordering many extrajudicial killings might be that type of crime. But I tell you, I am on thin ice here. I don't know exactly, but I certainly know from some of the discussion groups amongst the professors here at San Beda, it is very controversial. But I want to tie that to another issue. There was some discussion about the external pressure of the IMF. I'm trying to remember who brought that up. And that's where I really wanted to bring up a point here. There's Professor Stevenson brought up, three different approaches, which kind of sounded like ours. He called it Good King. I called ours White Knight. Never waste a crisis. And he had, I believe, a third one, or maybe even a fourth one. But well, then there's perhaps the thing I had was fragile coalitions and incremental reform. But what I wanted to emphasize here is the power of external pressure. The IMF and the ICC both can serve that purpose. It's almost as if the Philippines and some countries, let me say this, some countries have outsourced some of these attempts to improve governance by bringing in external judges or external commissioners. Georgia, the Republic of Georgia did that. A friend of mine actually served as an SEC commissioner for a while. So what I guess I'm trying to say here is, to a certain extent, some governance issues might be addressed more effectively through outside pressure. Of course, there's definitely pushback, and sovereignty can be insulted by such things. And I think we're seeing that with the ICC here. But the ICC, in some ways, to a certain extent, recognizes that sometimes it's impossible or impractical to address injustices within the system of the country, and there must be some sort of extra-national body to address these issues. And the IMF, to a certain extent, is that. The IMF and in Europe, the European Union and the European Central Bank facility are the ones who put pressure on places like Greece, on places like where's a good place has been on Sri Lanka. Had to get bailed out a few years ago and had to come under IMF conditionalities. So those types of things, governance can be affected by external pressure. And I think that's a more interesting question to ask about the ICC. Is it an external pressure point on the Philippines, and whether that's a welcome thing or not? Um, let's see, what else was, something that else I wanted to mention. Everyone talked about the Stevenson 3 points. Can someone, the first one's the white king, or the good king. The next one is the don't waste a crisis. What was his third one? Could someone help me? Someone knows this because it was brought up over and over again. Uh, Jan, what was the third?
Hello, Prof. Activating incremental reforms, Prof.
Oh, okay. See, I thought there was a fourth, actually. And I think it's worth mentioning because I kind of, he says activate incremental reforms. I said in my presentation, fragile coalitions. And we talked about how you would actually make those happen. But yes, the thing that I wanted to emphasize here, it kind of hit me. He brought up something else, and I would like to call it the prehistoric mammal approach. Does anyone can go back to their high school science and understand what the prehistoric mammal was before the big comet hit? What happened there? Does anyone remember their high school science or college science? What happened to the dinosaurs, Papa? Or, your kids might be asking Mama or Papa, what happened to the dinosaurs? Well, what did happen to the dinosaurs? Somebody knows this. You go on YouTube,
They
you can see.
disappeared.
Yeah, but
An
how?
asteroid
What
fell-
happened?
an
What's that?
asteroid fell on the
Jan,
Earth.
right? If you go on YouTube, you find these great, almost Hollywood type things talking about this huge asteroid that hit in Mexico and wiped out 90% of all the big animals, right? Now, the ones who survived were the small mammals, the ones who could burrow under the ground, the ones who had fur, the ones who are not in charge. And so what I'm trying to say here is, if I was teaching this course again, I would maybe try to slip something in here. And let's just say this first. This prehistoric mammal concept, which I'm using right now, maybe it's not the best term. It's doing little things now that can be used later on during a crisis. And he brought that up. He said, do little things now, get something done that maybe people don't really appreciate. And, Mr. Tyrannosaurus Rex didn't care what the little pygmy rat was doing. But it turned out that their approaches ended up, letting them create a revolution. So that's my perhaps imperfect analogy to this. And so, things like I believe someone correct me if I'm wrong. There's now a transparency. There's a Freedom of Information Act finally got passed. There's you do have your statements of wealth. Those little things might, somehow being energized through AI or better technology might turn out to be very decisive in the next round. Or maybe somebody some organizations, some NGO can sort of, push for certain things to maybe pull all those little pieces together to create something that could add to the effectiveness of the anti-corruption effort in the Philippines. Or Jan's interest in changing the law on anti-wiretapping could be another small step in that direction, which brought together might make a big difference. Okay, let's see. What time is it? Uh, is there any questions that I'm sort of skipping at this point that people feel, oh my gosh, I need to hear an answer at this point, or no? Because I wanted to sort of talk about something else. But if anyone is a burning question.
Yes, Prof. I have a question, Prof.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, Prof. This pertains to the anti-corruption agency in Indonesia, the
Okay.
KPSK.
KPK. KPK.
Okay.
Not, yeah.
Yes, I in the discussion previously, it was talking about how successful the KPSK was,
Mm,
and and what are the things that Indonesia is doing differently, because in the Philippines we have the ombudsman, we have the Siligan
mm.
Bayan. I just want to know what is Indonesia doing differently, and why the KPK is successful there in Indonesia.
That's something I could ask my wife. She was working with an NGO that was supporting the KPK right after the Big Bang revolution that kind of happened in the late 90s in in Indonesia. It's too bad I can't have her as a guest speaker. Maybe that would be very funny, or one of her colleagues. Maybe one of these days in another class I'll do that, but not today. I know she would yell at me if I tried to bring her in now. So let me try to give my best answer on this. I think the best answer of why the KPK was so effective early on, it was new. And it sort of galvanized, it acted as Professor Koberly mentioned, a sort of a focal point unto itself. It was so new, it captured the imagination. Uh, there was nothing before that even close to what this was. It got a lot of support from outside. These people were trained up who were selected, and for a while they resisted capture. But I will say right now, and I can't be sure about it, but if anyone did some research on the KPK, they would probably find that there's growing disillusionment with the KPK and its ability to take on these issues, which is sad. And even I wish we could say that things are constantly getting better, but it's definitely a up and down situation right now. And even in America, it's awfully tough right now for us. Uh, but that doesn't mean necessarily that there is no hope. In the United States right now, lawyers and judges are fighting back, and they're doing a very good job of that. And also, what's fighting back is civil society with educational institutions. And I want to share with you one story that's breaking right now in the United States, and it actually goes to collective action. I don't know if you heard this, but Trump went after various universities, and he said to them, we're going to cut off your funding unless you stop all this DII nonsense. We're going to cut off your funding unless you throw out all the uh, different departments that are bringing in woke thinking. And if you discriminate in front of anyone in terms of their non-meritocracy, we're going to cut off all your funding. And we want you to sign an agreement to this effect. And, Columbia University was one of the first ones they went after. And Columbia said, okay. They gave in. And a couple other universities did as well. But then a couple of other universities said, hey, wait a second, let's band together and let's get a letter together and send this statement. And you can find the statement now online. let's put this letter together and say, no, we are not going to do these things. We're going to resist. And if you are going to try to cut off our funding for it, we will take you to court. I don't know if they said it exactly that way, but this letter went out a few weeks ago. And at first, only about 15 different institutions did it. It was very scary to put your name down first, very scary to put your name down second. But then it kept going and more and more. And now we're over 500. And guess what? No one wants to be the last. You think I went and looked up where Boston College was. They were sort of in the middle, and I felt good about that. At least they weren't at the end. So, because the ones at the end are going to look like cowards. Well, the ones in the beginning are going to look very courageous, and the ones in the middle, they could spin it any way they want. But you can see here, this is very similar to the situation. I'm going to now do something historically, go back. I know you guys may have heard about the Berlin Wall. That was when the Germans started smashing the wall and trying to break that down. And there was protesters there. And, my professor in Germany, when we were talking about this, he said, no one wanted to be the first 100 people because they know they might have gotten their heads bashed in by the riot police. But once you had 2 or 3 or 4,000 or even 20,000 people there, no one wanted to be the person who said they were on the sidelines. And that's the same thing. If you can create this momentum, it becomes easier and easier to make change. And you see that in EDSA. The EDSA 1 and EDSA 2 are great examples of that kind of being built up. And the whole EDSA 2, there was a focal point there. There was the trial of Arap, and there was the dismissal of so-called evidence that was going to basically convict him. And it was somehow dismissed on a technicality. And on the basis of that, everyone got very angry. They started going on their cell phones. Back then, they were doing their SMSs to each other. And I was there. I was watching it happen. We were playing sports and said, look at these messages that people want to go to EDSA tomorrow. And so EDSA 2 started that way. And, that was an example of what Professor Koberly talked about as a focal point. So those are sort of my responses and impressions. And then I want to say one other thing before we wrap it up. I want to say, first of all, I'd say about now, a year and a half ago, I started this class. I did it once before with students, and I'd wanted to do this class since 2015. And actually, in 2015 was the last time I taught, and this idea was sort of in an outline approach. And I went off to Laos and Vietnam and didn't have the time to do this, but then I was asked back and I said, well, this would be a great time to do this, Karskin. So I pulled up all the material that I had, and I actually had a nice collection of stuff, but some of it looked at, that's okay, that's okay, that's good. But so of course, I started looking online, blah, blah, blah. And Professor Stevenson's Harvard speech, which is very similar to his Indonesian speech, was one of the first things I saw. And I'll be very frank with you. I felt intimidated by that speech. I felt intimidated by his level of knowledge versus what I knew. And why I'm sharing that with you? I think with you guys probably feel or felt at this point less intimidated than I did 15 months ago. And I think in some ways, with the knowledge you've gained through this course, puts you in a position that if any of you guys were in that audience at Harvard or at the University of Indonesia or in Oxford asking questions, I think your questions would be just as insightful, if not more insightful, than most of the other people who were asking questions. So I also got the sense that everyone was a little bit, now I look at it, I almost feel it's a little bit naive and overly simplified. So I think we have made this journey together, and I very much appreciate you coming along the way with me, because I listening to you guys, and then I didn't share the question and answer session. Your responses were just as good. just as good. And I very, very much appreciate that. So, and let me just at the last point, while all your answers were good, I still think we can think more about applying and using the tools that we have been talking about and building them into our analysis. And I saw it today, but I did see it a little bit uneven. And I want to emphasize that when it comes to making your proposals for the paper, which will be 4 weeks from now. So what you really have to do between now and then, and I have some slides that I did before over the other class. We haven't got a chance to get them. I will probably put them up online as, a voluntary resource you can take a look at. I will put together some presentation. I'll put it up on YouTube and share it with you about how to go about choosing a topic and then proposing it. And I'm going to emphasize again application of the tools that we've used to the situations at hand. And then there's also the big question of how to write, and that will also be brought up as well. But from what I heard, people were very articulate today. I do notice that some people wrote things out, and that's fine. That was good. It shows a lot of preparation made by you guys, and I really think you've all come along and truly have done a great job so far. So I want to thank you for that. And I think at that point, we could probably call it an early night and let people get to their Saturday evening issues of dinner, family, fun, TV shows, whatever. And we will be meeting 4 weeks, I believe 4 weeks from now exactly is the next class. And that's your chance. Really try. I cannot emphasize investing now in a topic and bringing it forward and proposing something and giving me an opportunity to give feedback, or someone else to give you feedback. You will reap those rewards when it comes time to writing the paper. It's always easy to procrastinate, but you will be rewarded by early action. That's all I can say. So unless anyone has some questions, we can call it an evening. I thank you again for a great semester, great class. I'm going to tell Father Ranny that we did this and brag about how great you were.
Thank you, Prof.
All right, you
Thank you.
guys. You take care. Thanks
Thank
for being
you.
part of
Thank
this.
you.
Thanks for buying in.
Thank you, Prof.